Here's a guy who thinks he's found a form of Pascal's wager that makes sense.
Christian apologists, let's be real. Pascal's wager is famous, but it's got some major flaws. The pitch is simple. If God exists and you believe, you win heaven. If God exists and you don't believe, you lose big time. If God doesn't exist, you lose nothing in comparison to gaining eternity, so it's smart to bet on God.
Yeah, this isn't even an argument for God's existence. It's an argument for believing in God's existence, whether he actually exists or not.
But here's the thing. Philosophers have pointed out that Pascal's wager feels like a gamble with no clear rules. Which God are you betting on? Can you even force belief? And doesn't believing just in case feel kind of shallow? Enter Joseph Butler. In 1736, this 18th century bishop and philosopher offered an upgrade to Pascal's wager. Instead of playing theological roulette, Butler says, take Christianity seriously. Investigate it carefully with an open mind.
Why only Christianity? Shouldn't you treat any worldview you come across that way?
Here's his reasoning. For probable proofs being added not only increase the evidence but multiply it. A mistake in rejecting Christianity could have far more serious consequences than a mistake in accepting it.
Yeah, but that's not just true of Christianity. It's not even most severely true of Christianity. Shannon Q once pointed out that by this logic, you should try to convince yourself of the religion that has the most sadistic depiction of hell. This isn't really Christianity. Islam has a much more clearly unpleasant hell than Christianity does. Check out Surah 456. In fact, it's not clear that hell is even a biblical concept.
The concept of hell, as we understand it today, does not have biblical origins. Hey everybody, I'm Dan McClellan. I'm a scholar of the Bible and religion. And if you look throughout a translation like the King James Version, the word hell occurs across the Old and New Testaments. But it is a rendering of multiple different words. In the Old Testament, it's always the same Hebrew word, Sheol. And the word Sheol does not refer to the conceptual package that we understand today as hell. It actually just refers to the abode of all the dead, because they had an entirely different conceptual package about the afterlife back then. In ancient Israel and Judah, everybody went to the same place, righteous, wicked, or somewhere in between.
The concept of punishment in the afterlife was a later invention.
And this doesn't really begin to change until oppression and persecution begins to force Judahites to wonder where God's justice is going to be realized. Because Judahites and later Judeans and Jewish folks were experiencing an awful lot of oppression at the hands of larger empires like Assyria, like Babylon, Persia, and then the Hellenistic empires. And in all of this, they're seeing a lot of their own people, whom they consider righteous, suffering and dying without seeing God's justice. And they're also seeing an awful lot of wicked people who are responsible for the oppression and the persecution and the suffering, not experiencing God's judgment. So this results in the wisdom literature that is contemplating the problem of evil and where God's justice is. And so we see this in Ecclesiastes, we see this in Job, we see this sometimes in the Psalms. And it's also getting explored by Greco-Roman period Jewish authors who are writing texts that would not end up in the Bible, like the text of 1st Enoch, where they begin to develop ideas about post-mortem divine punishment and post-mortem divine reward. Maybe it is after death that God's justice is being realized.
This idea seems to be based more in the Apocrypha than in the canonical books of the Bible.
So there are a lot of different ways that these authors are exploring the idea of post-mortem divine punishment. And it's not all consistent. And by the time we get to the New Testament, we have three different kind of general categories of post-mortem divine punishment. One is just annihilationism. If you're wicked, upon death, you are destroyed, you cease to exist. Another is temporary conscious torment followed either by annihilation or salvation. You are punished and then you cease to exist, or your punishment pays the fine and then you go on to salvation. And then the last category is the eternal conscious torment. And these three categories bubble to the surface in a variety of different ways in different parts of the New Testament. And we see all three of them in the Gospels. We don't see any references to hell in Paul. We see some other folks referring to them, particularly in the book of Revelation.
Whether you end up being tortured forever if you don't believe in Christianity is not something that the Bible clearly states.
In other words, Butler's wager isn't about forcing belief, it's about asking whether rejecting Christianity is the bigger risk.
But even if you infer that rejecting Christianity is a bigger risk, the only way to minimize that risk, if you don't find the evidence for Christianity naturally convincing, is to try to force yourself to believe in it.
Let's dig in a little bit. Pascal's wager has some obvious issues, and Butler's wager fixes them. First, there's the many gods objection. Pascal assumes that you're betting on the Christian God, but critics argue there are countless other options.
Yes, and some of those options have conceptions of hell that I'd far rather want to avoid than the Christian idea of hell.
Zeus, Odin, Vishnu, Allah, you name it. What if you're wrong? Butler doesn't ask you to blindly gamble on a deity. Instead, he challenges you to start with Christianity. Why? Because it has uniquely strong evidence that sets it apart, and we'll get to that in just a minute.
If you should believe in it because it has uniquely strong evidence, then the fact that there are high stakes in whether you believe in it or not is rather irrelevant. If I find the evidence convincing, I'll believe in it, and if I find the evidence unconvincing, I won't, regardless of what the stakes are, so why even bring that up?
Second is the impossibility objection. Pascal's wager makes it sound like belief is a switch that you can just flip.
Wrong.
But belief doesn't work that way. You can't just decide to believe Australia doesn't exist for $1 million. Butler gets it. He's not asking you to force belief. He's asking you to carefully investigate. Inquiry is voluntary, rational, and evidence-driven.
And neither the evidence that Christianity is true nor the evidence that it even claims that you'll be punished for eternity if you don't believe in it is convincing enough to get me to believe in it. Also, if your inquiry is motivated by the risk of hell, it's not entirely voluntary.
If Christianity isn't true, you won't believe it. But if the evidence convinces you, belief flows naturally.
Pascal actually recommended just going through the motions of believing in Christianity and that you would eventually sincerely believe. I doubt this would work for everyone, and you'd essentially be manipulating yourself into a belief.
Third, there's the irrationality objection. Isn't believing for a reward just kind of selfish? Critics of Pascal's wager argue that belief should be based on evidence, not self-interest. Butler's wager aligns perfectly with evidentialism. It's not about believing for the reward. It's about carefully weighing up the evidence and following it where it leads.
Shouldn't you treat every claim that way? You're making it sound like the prospect of reward or punishment should play no role in your epistemic approach, but if that's the case, what's the point in bringing it up in the first place?
So why investigate Christianity and not, say, Islam or Buddhism? Fair question, but Christianity makes bold historical claims, none bigger than the resurrection of Jesus. The resurrection wasn't a whispered legend. It was publicly proclaimed right after Jesus' death in Jerusalem, the very place it happened. The apostles didn't just preach it, they preached it under hostile scrutiny, risking torture and execution.
It's a common trope among apologists that the apostles were martyred for saying that Jesus rose from the dead, but there's no evidence of this. Many of them could very well have been martyred, but given that they were followers of someone who tried to overthrow the Roman occupation of Judea, they didn't need to preach that Jesus was resurrected in order to be targeted. Also, if you look into the circumstances under which Muhammad founded Islam, they weren't any better. He was constantly under threat because he preached against the polytheism of the Quraysh, who had a lot of power in the region at the time.
People don't willingly suffer and die for something they know is a lie.
Even if they believe that Jesus rose from the grave, that wouldn't rule out the possibility that they were mistaken or delusional. These are both colossally more probable explanations than a guy being resurrected. And again, there's no evidence that any of Jesus' followers suffered or died specifically because of their belief in the resurrection or that Jesus was God.
And an earlier point that Bill made, that the disciples were all willing to die for their faith. I didn't hear one piece of evidence for that. I hear that claim a lot, but having read every Christian source from the first 500 years of Christianity, I'd like him to tell us what the piece of evidence is that the disciples died for their belief in the resurrection.
Now, compare that to Islam. The Quran denies Muhammad performed miracles. Say, for example, Surah 2950, which says, "I am only a clear warner."
Yeah, but according to the Isra and the Miraj, he had a flying horse, and during his lifetime he was persecuted for claiming to have received revelation from God, which sounds pretty miraculous to me. Is that too banal for you to be worthy of taking seriously? And do you really take every claim that someone has performed miracles seriously? Have you looked into the claimed miracles of Satya Sai Baba? He is claimed to have performed miraculous healings and resurrections too. Are you investigating those miracles as fair-mindedly as you investigated Christianity?
And the miracle stories in the Hadiths come much later, with zero risk for promoting them. Krishna, his miracles like lifting a mountain were written centuries later, blending legend with theology. Buddha, stories of him taming elephants or walking at birth emerged hundreds of years after his life. Zoroaster, his miracles were recorded millennia later with no hostile witnesses or historical evidence.
Sathya Sai Baba's miracles were reported when he was still alive, which was just 14 years ago. We don't have to rely on documents written years later by people who weren't even eyewitnesses. We have eyewitness accounts from people who are still alive today. And again, there's no reason to believe that any of Jesus' followers were martyred for any supernatural beliefs.
Christianity's claims are public, early, and bold. So, if you're going to investigate one religion, it makes more sense to start here.
The issue I have is that it seems like you've also stopped there. I get the impression that once you became convinced of Christianity, your mind closed off to all other belief systems.
So, here's how Butler's wager plays out. If Christianity is false, you lose a bit of time, but you gain a stronger, more informed understanding of one of history's most influential religions.
Unless Islam turns out to be true, in which case you lose a lot more than time.
You become a credible critic, not just another Reddit atheist recycling bad arguments. And let's be real, even people with YouTube channels or even PhDs behind their name are guilty of being uninformed critics.
One of those Wojaks was clearly Bart Ehrman. Please explain how he is an uninformed critic.
Now, if Christianity is true, you gain truth, purpose, and eternal life. That's a really big deal. The stakes are high, but the cost of entry is small. Are you willing to give Christianity a fair shot?
I've been giving it a fair shot for more than 30 years, and the more I learn, the less sense it makes.
You'll know that you've taken Butler's wager when you can present the strongest case for Christianity and explain why you still reject it. Now, I've been following the whole apologetics, counter-apologetics movement for over a decade, and I've yet to see this done.
So the people who were Christians and left Christianity because they looked into it and concluded that it makes no sense weren't giving it a fair appraisal? You don't think they could make a strong case for it? They obviously used to believe there was a strong case to be made for it if they used to be Christians.
Personally, I would love to see skeptics take me up on this challenge. And I can guarantee you that the people that will be most offended at this video are the people who could stand to take the challenge the most.
I confess that I would fail this challenge because I have no idea how to make any case for plainly incoherent claims. I have no idea how to make any case for the universe being created by a timeless, spaceless, disembodied mind. I don't know how to make an argument for such a self-contradictory notion. To everyone who helps me out on Patreon, you're a big help. Thanks so much.